Relationships, huh? They can be a real wild ride sometimes. Ups, downs, twists and turns. And, one of those things that can feel like the biggest drop on the roller coaster? Conflict.
Oh, absolutely. Conflict. It's something most of us try to avoid.
Like the plague. Right.
Hmm.
But what if I told you that conflict might actually be the secret ingredient to a stronger, more fulfilling relationship?
Now, that might sound a bit counterintuitive, but we're going deep today into an episode from the Lovelinkage podcast, and they have this really fascinating perspective. They actually view conflict as, get this, an opportunity for growth.
Okay, so conflict equals growth. That's a new one for me. Color me intrigued, but maybe a little skeptical too.
Right. But think about it. When we avoid conflict, what are we really doing? We're sweeping those important issues under the rug. And guess what? Those unresolved issues, they don't just disappear, they fester. And they can lead to resentment, to distance, and ultimately they can really weaken the foundation of the relationship.
So facing those issues head on, even if it feels uncomfortable in the moment, could actually give us a chance to understand our partner better, work through those differences, and come out stronger on the other side.
Exactly. And one of the things conflict isn't just about these big blowout arguments. It's really any time our needs or expectations clash with our partners.
Oh, okay, so like even just disagreeing on where to eat dinner or something.
Exactly. Or maybe navigating those differences in parenting styles. Right. It can be big or small.
So even those little everyday disagreements, those are actually opportunities to learn and grow together as a couple. Never really thought about it that way. Okay, but if conflict is so important for growth, how do we make sure we're doing it in a healthy way? Because let's be real, some fights can just leave you feeling drained and disconnected, not closer at all.
That's such a great point. And actually, Love Linkage really dug into this idea of healthy conflict versus toxic conflict.
Mm,
They pointed out that healthy conflict focuses on actually solving the problem, working together,
mm.
whereas toxic conflict, it becomes this battle of egos, and the goal is to hurt or punish your partner.
Oof. Yeah, so it's like the difference between saying, hey, when you forgot to pick up the dry cleaning, I felt stressed because I need that outfit for a meeting, versus you're so inconsiderate you never think about anyone but yourself.
You got it. One is expressing a feeling, explaining the impact of an action. The other is just a personal attack that's going to escalate the conflict. And Love Linkage really highlighted the damage those toxic conflict patterns can do,
Yeah.
especially things like sarcasm or, the silent treatment or constantly bringing up past mistakes. These tactics just erode trust and they create this hostile environment where real connection becomes almost impossible.
Okay, so we know conflict is normal, even healthy, but sometimes it feels like we're just arguing about the same things over and over again. Why is that? Why is it so hard to break those patterns, especially when we really do care about each other?
Well, Love Linkage used a really interesting metaphor to explain this. They talk about the spice in our relationships.
Spice. Okay, tell me more.
Right, those differences in personality, upbringing, maybe even those love languages, the things that make us unique individuals, that's the spice.
I like that, spice, because those differences are what keeps things interesting, right?
Yeah,
But like with any spice, too much can be a bit overwhelming.
absolutely. Too much spice and things can get volatile and chaotic. Too little, and well, things might get a little boring. The key is finding that balance. Understanding how much spice your unique relationship can handle and learning to manage it effectively.
Okay, finding the balance. I'm on board with that. But how do we actually do that? So let's say a conflict pops up. What are those first crucial steps to prevent it from spiraling out of control?
Love Linkage broke down the stages of conflict for us. And it starts with the initial spark. And they had a really interesting observation. They said the spark is often like a seemingly small incident, but the real fuel for the fire often lies in these deeper emotional needs that maybe aren't being met.
Ah, so it might seem like you're arguing about whose turn it is to empty the dishwasher,
Hmm.
but maybe what's really going on is that one person is feeling unappreciated or like the other isn't pulling their weight around the house.
Exactly. And if those underlying needs aren't addressed, that tiny little spark, well, it can quickly escalate into a full-blown firestorm. All of a sudden, you're bringing up past resentments, you're making generalizations and logic out the window.
Oh, I've been there.
Yeah.
You're arguing about everything under the sun, and by the end, you're just exhausted and frustrated.
Yep. And that's why Love Linkage really stressed the importance of recognizing those early warning signs, that things are escalating, and having some strategies in place to de-escalate before it reaches the point of no return. They actually compared it to hitting the pause button on a movie that's getting too intense.
So I can always come back to it later, right? When we're both calmer and more collected.
Exactly. And they emphasized setting a specific time to revisit the conversation is key. Otherwise, it can feel like you're just avoiding the issue, which can lead to more resentment later on.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've taken a break, we've calmed down, we're ready to talk. Now what? How do we actually communicate our feelings effectively without triggering another argument?
This is where communication tools come in. And Love Linkage, like many relation experts, is a huge advocate for using I statements. It's such a simple but powerful technique.
Yeah, I've heard of I statements, but I'll be honest, sometimes I forget to use them in the heat of the moment. So remind me, why are they so effective?
Well, think about it. When you say something like, you always make me feel so unimportant, that's an accusation. It puts your partner immediately on the defensive,
Oh,
right?
yeah, because they feel attacked.
Exactly. But when you use an I statement, you're shifting the focus to your own feelings and your experience. So instead of blaming your partner, you might say, I felt hurt and unimportant when you made plans without considering my schedule.
Okay, yeah, I see the difference. It feels less accusatory, more like you're inviting your partner to understand your perspective.
Exactly. And it opens the door for a much more constructive conversation where you can both work toward a solution together.
Okay, so I statements. Got it. But even when we're really trying to communicate well, sometimes it feels like we're speaking different languages. Like, I know I'm saying something, but my partner just isn't getting it.
Ah, the classic communication breakdown. This is where active listening becomes super important. Love Linkage really emphasize that it's not enough to just hear the words your partner is saying. You have to actively engage. You have to make a conscious effort to understand the meaning behind those words, the emotions, and the needs they're trying to communicate.
So, reflecting back what we hear to make sure we're on the same page, Love Linkage suggested that right. Something like, so you're saying you felt overwhelmed at work, and that's why you snapped at me earlier.
Perfect example. Reflecting back does a couple of important things. First, it helps clear up any misunderstandings. Because sometimes we think we know what our partner's thinking or feeling, but we're actually way off.
Oh, all the time.
Right. And reflecting back helps to check those assumptions and make sure you're both on the same page.
And it also shows your partner that you're really listening and trying to see things from their side.
Exactly. It creates this sense of validation and safety, which can really de-escalate the tension.
Okay, so I, statements for expressing ourselves, active listening for understanding our partner, great tools. But what about those times when things are so heated, emotions are running high, and it feels impossible to have a rational conversation? Like, we've tried all the techniques, but we're just yelling at each other.
In those moments, it's time to take a break.
Step away.
And remember, taking a break isn't about avoiding the issue.
Like we talked about earlier, it's more like hitting pause.
Right. Love Linkage really emphasized setting a specific time to revisit the conversation, though.
Otherwise, it can turn into this unspoken agreement to avoid the problem, and that's not helpful.
So something like, hey, I'm feeling really overwhelmed. I need a break. Can we talk about this again in an hour after I've had a chance to calm down?
That gives everyone time to process, maybe gain a little perspective, come back with cooler heads. Okay, I'm starting to get a much better sense of how to approach conflict in a more constructive way. But what about those recurring arguments? Those issues that just keep popping up no matter how many times we talk about them.
Ah, yes. The dreaded conflict loop.
Yeah.
It can feel like you're stuck in this broken record.
The same fight over and over.
Yeah.
So frustrating.
Right. It's often a sign that there's a deeper issue that hasn't been fully addressed, like the tip of the iceberg, arguing about something on the surface, but there's a whole lot more going on underneath.
And that's where things can get tricky.
It is, and that's where Love Linkage suggested seeking professional help from a therapist, especially if you're stuck in a destructive pattern.
They did mention they're interviewing a couples therapist in their next episode. Might be a good resource for our listeners.
For sure. There's absolutely no shame in seeking professional guidance. A therapist can provide a safe space to explore those deeper issues and help you learn some new, healthier communication patterns.
Okay, so let's say we've had a fight, we've taken a break, we've talked it through, and hopefully we've reached some kind of understanding, some resolution.
Yeah.
What are those final steps? How do we rebuild and strengthen the relationship after a conflict?
This is where Love Linkage really emphasized forgiveness and gratitude.
Yeah.
And they were very clear. Forgiveness isn't about condoning your partner's actions or pretending they didn't hurt you.
It's about letting go of the anger and resentment, right?
Yeah. It's about recognizing that we all make mistakes. Holding on to those hurts, that's what really damages the relationship over time.
And gratitude. Even after a fight, it's powerful. It can shift our whole perspective and help us reconnect.
Right. Instead of dwelling on what they did wrong, try to remember what they do right, all the things you love and appreciate about them.
It's like remembering why you planted that flower in the first place, even when it needs a little pruning or fertilizer to really thrive.
Perfect analogy. And just like a well-tended garden, a relationship that's nurtured with understanding, communication, and forgiveness, well, it has the potential to be something really beautiful.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our love linkage deep dive. We talked about reframing conflict as fertilizer, the stages of conflict, practical techniques for communication, de-escalation, forgiveness, and even when it might be time to seek professional help.
But as we move into the next part of our exploration, I want to bring the focus back to you, our listener.
Yes, because we shared a lot of tools and insights, but ultimately, it's up to each of you to decide how you want to apply them in your own unique relationships.
So what are the biggest takeaways for you? Which strategies resonated the most? And what are you most excited to try out in your own life? Think about that as we head into the next part of our deep dive.
Welcome back. We're diving deeper into those conflict resolution strategies that the Love Linkage podcast talked about. It's one thing to know, intellectually, that conflict can be good for our relationships. But actually putting that into practice, that's a whole other story, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's one thing to understand the idea of conflict as, fertilizer for growth, but those heated moments, they're never easy. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty. What are some communication tools we can use when disagreements come up?
Yeah, let's get practical.
Yeah.
Because I think we all have those moments where we know we should be communicating calmly and rationally, but then emotions take over and things just, boom, spiral.
It happens. That's why having a toolkit of strategies is so important. It's like having a fire extinguisher handy. You might not need it every day, but when you do, you're really grateful you have it.
Okay, I love that analogy. The conflict resolution toolkit. So what are some of those essential tools we should make sure we have in there?
Well, we talked about I statements in the last part. I just want to emphasize again, they can be so powerful. Seriously, a game changer when it comes to shifting the whole dynamic of a conversation.
I statements, right? I'm ready to go a little deeper with those. We know they're supposed to help us communicate better, but I'm curious about, the psychology behind them. What makes them so different from just saying how we feel?
It's about where the focus lies. I statements. They center on your own experience. You're not blaming your partner, not accusing. When you say, you always make me feel, well, you're putting them on the defensive.
Right. It's like you're pointing the finger and they instantly feel like they have to protect themselves.
Exactly. But when you start with, I feel, you're taking ownership. You're saying, this is my experience. You're not saying your partner caused your feelings, but you are explaining how their actions impacted you.
So instead of saying, you're so inconsiderate, you never listen, you might try, I feel unheard and unimportant when you interrupt me.
Perfect example. It's still direct, it's honest, but it's framed in a way that's much less likely to trigger that automatic defensiveness.
And it opens the door for conversation.
Right.
Not a battle.
Exactly. The goal is to understand each other better and find a solution together, not to win the argument.
Okay, I statements. All about taking responsibility for our own feelings. But then there's the other side of the coin. How do we make sure we're really hearing what our partner is trying to say? Like truly understanding, even in the middle of a conflict.
That's where active listening comes in. And it's so much more than just, sitting there quietly while the other person talks. It's about engaging, both verbally and non-verbally.
Lovelinkage talked about making eye contact, putting away distractions, using body language to show that you're present.
All so important. And they also talked about reflecting back what you hear, just to make sure you're really getting it.
Yeah, like summarizing what your partner said, to be sure you understand correctly. So what I'm hearing is you feel overwhelmed at work, and that's why you've been short-tempered lately.
Spot on. Reflecting back does a couple of really important things. First, it helps clear up any misunderstandings. Sometimes we think we know what our partner's thinking or feeling, but we're totally off.
All the time. It's like we have this whole narrative in our heads.
Right. And reflecting back just helps you check those assumptions, make sure you're both on the same page.
And the other thing it does is it shows our partner, hey, I'm listening. I'm trying to understand.
Exactly. Validation. It creates safety.
Yeah.
And that can de-escalate the tension so much.
Okay, so we have I statements for expressing ourselves, active listening for understanding our partner. Great tools. But what about those times when emotions are just too high? It feels impossible to have a productive conversation. Like we're both so upset, we're not thinking clearly.
That's when taking a break becomes crucial,
Hmm.
really important. And again, taking a break isn't about avoiding the issue. It's not about sweeping it under the rug.
Right. It's like that pause button.
Exactly. And Love Linkage, they were adamant about setting a specific time to come back and talk.
Because otherwise it's just too easy to let it slide. Right. And that just creates more resentment.
Exactly. So you might say, hey, I'm feeling overwhelmed right now. I need a break. Can we talk about this again in an hour after I've had a chance to calm down?
Gives both partners time to process, come back with a clearer head.
Exactly. And when you do come back to the conversation, the goal is to find a solution that works for both of you, not to prove the other person wrong.
Okay. This is making so much sense.
Yeah.
But what about those arguments that just keep happening? The same issue popping up over and over again.
The dreaded conflict loop, like you're stuck on a broken record player.
So frustrating.
Right.
You talk about it and you talk about it and it just keeps coming back.
It happens. And often that's a sign that there's a deeper issue that's not being addressed.
Yeah.
Like the tip of the iceberg, you're arguing about what's on the surface, but there's a whole lot more going on underneath.
And how do we even begin to uncover that?
This is where Love Linkage recommended seeking some professional help, talking to a therapist, especially if you feel like you're in a destructive pattern of conflict.
It's not a sign of weakness, is it, to get some help?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
It can be so beneficial. A therapist can provide that safe, neutral space to explore those deeper issues and help you develop some healthier communication patterns.
I remember Love Linkage said they're interviewing a couples therapist in their next episode. Might be worth checking out.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's say we've had a fight, we've taken a break, we've talked it through, and hopefully we've come to some sort of resolution, some understanding. What are those final steps? How do we rebuild after a conflict? Strengthen things.
Love Linkage talked about the importance of forgiveness and gratitude, and they made a really key point: forgiveness. It doesn't mean you condone your partner's actions. Doesn't mean you pretend they didn't hurt you.
It's about letting go.
Exactly. Letting go of that anger and resentment that keeps you stuck. We all make mistakes. Holding on to hurt, that just damages the relationship.
And gratitude, even after a fight, can be so powerful. It shifts our perspective, helps us reconnect.
Absolutely. Instead of focusing on what they did wrong, try to remember all the things they do right, all the good stuff.
Like remembering why you planted that flower in the first place, right?
Yeah.
Even if it needs a little pruning or fertilizer sometimes to thrive.
Beautiful analogy. Just like a garden, a relationship that's nurtured with understanding, communication, and forgiveness, well, it can truly blossom.
So we've covered a lot in this Love Linkage deep dive. Reframing conflict as fertilizer, practical communication techniques, how to de-escalate, forgiveness, and even when it might be time to seek professional help.
Now I want to bring it back to you, our listener. We've shared all these insights, but ultimately it's up to you to decide how you want to use them.
What are you taking away from this? Which strategies are you most excited to try in your own relationships? Think about that as we head into the final part of our deep dive. Welcome back to the deep dive.
We've been talking about conflict in relationships and, really exploring this idea from Love Linkage that maybe conflict isn't always a bad thing.
Right. It's not always something to fear or avoid.
They called it fertilizer for our relationships.
It's not always the most pleasant thing to deal with, but it can really help those relationships grow if we handle it the right way.
So I guess it all comes down to having the right tools, right? Just like you need the right tools to tend a garden.
Exactly. We need the right skills and strategies to tend to our relationship.
Okay, so let's talk about those tools. What are some of the key takeaways from our Love Linkage deep dive? What should we add to our conflict resolution toolkit?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's important to remember that conflict is normal. It's going to happen. It's a natural part of any close relationship.
It doesn't mean we're with the wrong person or that the relationship is doomed. Not at all. It's actually an opportunity to learn, to grow closer, to build a stronger foundation.
But it's all about how we approach it.
Yeah.
Right. We need a healthy mindset, and we need the right skills.
And I think that's where the Love Linkage episode was so helpful.
I agree. They gave us some very concrete tools.
Statements, active listening.
Taking breaks when things get heated, knowing when it might be time to reach out for professional help, all such valuable tools.
And don't forget about forgiveness and gratitude, even after an argument.
So important. Choosing to let go of the resentment and just, remembering the good stuff. All the reasons we love our partner.
Okay, so here's a little challenge for our listeners. Think about one strategy or technique that really resonated with you from this love linkage deep dive.
It could be anything. Using I statements more often, practicing active listening, taking those mindful pauses before you react.
Or even just remembering that conflict is an opportunity for growth, not a sign of failure.
Pick one thing and commit to trying it out. Experiment. See what works for you. Because ultimately, we want this to be more than just information. We want you to feel empowered.
To create stronger, healthier, and more fulfilling relationships.
And remember, conflict doesn't have to be this destructive force. It can be a chance to connect, to grow closer, to deepen that intimacy.
So embrace the spice of your relationships. Approach those conflicts with curiosity, with compassion, and with the willingness to learn and grow together.
This has been such an insightful conversation. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into conflict. We hope you've learned some valuable things today.
And remember, every conflict, even the really tough ones, it's a chance to create something stronger, something even more beautiful.
Thanks for listening, everyone.